think we can all agree that of all the animals God created, dogs are the best. Right? So I think one of the... I know some of you want to debate that with me, but you're just wrong. One of the reasons that we love dogs so much is because they are loyal, right? Dogs are fiercely loyal to their masters, to their owners. Our dogs demonstrate that. We have two very small dogs. They're both rescues, and so they have all kinds of oddities. But they often demonstrate their loyalty through their unique relationship with each other, as well as the game of tug. So if you ever played tug with a dog, dogs love to play tug. Well, most dogs do. And it can be with a bone or a rope or a stick or whatever, where you let the dog have one end of it and you take the other and you just kind of tug, right? And the dog gets so excited about this because they're fighting and they're growling and they're trying. And you can't let the dog win because then they won't respect you. And so you have to hold on no matter what. And so we've got these little dogs, and I'll sometimes have them way up here and they'll be dangling. And no, that's not true. That would be abusive. But our littlest dog, Ross, he loves to play tug. Tug is one of his favorite things to do. We'll go out in the backyard and just find a stick because he likes to play tug with sticks. And I'll get down and I'll hold the stick, and he'll latch on, and I'll start pulling on it. And I can't pull very hard because he's little and he'll let go. But he gets really fierce. His eyes scrunch up, and he's growling at me, and he's baring his teeth. Now, the problem is that our other dog, Miley, she's a rescue, we didn't name her, but our other dog, Miley, she doesn't like tug. In fact, as far as we can tell, she thinks that tug is disrespectful and that you shouldn't fight with your owner. And so I'll be playing tug with Roscoe, and Miley will come sprinting across the backyard as soon as he growls at me. And she rears up on her hind legs and jumps on top of him and pushes him away from me and starts snarling at him because he shouldn't be growling at me. This is her kind of showing her loyalty to her master, me, by saying, don't growl at master. Now, that's fine when she does that to Roscoe, but Miley's a small dog. And there have been times when we've been with other dogs that are 3 or 4 times her size, and I'll be playing tug with them, and they start to growl, and she does the same thing. She comes flying across, and she'll jump at them, not realizing what she's getting herself into. And at that moment, I have to drop whatever I'm tugging and grab her, or else she's a goner. But I like that she's loyal. And I think that's one of the reasons we love dogs, is because dogs are loyal to us. And actually, I think that sometimes that's one of the reasons we like Jesus, right? Is that Jesus is loyal to us. And we know that no matter what we do, no matter how bad we might be, whatever mistakes we might make, whatever sins we bring to the table, we know that Jesus is loyal to us. In fact, he's so loyal to us that he was willing to give his life for us, right? So that we could have eternal life if we place our faith in him. And we love that Jesus is loyal to us. But doesn't this raise a question for us? If Jesus is this loyal to us, how loyal are we to him? Do you ever think about that? Am I as loyal to Jesus as he is to me? Or maybe the question is, am I as loyal to Jesus as I am to other people or other things? What does it even mean or look like to be loyal to Jesus? What does it mean to be devoted to Jesus? Because I think all of us would say, if we're someone who believes in Jesus, that we ought to be devoted to him. We ought to be loyal to him. So I want to take some time today kind of unpacking this idea. What does it look like for us to be loyal or to be devoted to Jesus? To make Jesus the King of our lives. And to do that, we're going to look at a story in John chapter 12. All right, in John chapter 12, Jesus has returned to the town of Bethany. And Bethany is where we saw Jesus last week in John 11 when he raised Lazarus from the dead. And he's gone away, but he's returned now because it's almost time for the Passover. And so Jesus is here, and he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem for the last week before his death. But just before that, just before the triumphal entry, Jesus is in Bethany, and he's at a banquet in his honor. And that's where we picked the story in John chapter 12, verse 1. John writes this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, so it's perfume, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, I just want to stop here just for a second because this is a cool phrase. I think John is actually here making a reference to the Old Testament. And so if you were a Jewish person and you grew up learning the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, this would have triggered a thought in your mind of this phrase that appears over and over in the Old Testament. In fact, it's the most in Leviticus and Numbers. But this phrase appears 24 different times in the Old Testament. The phrase is a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And it always has to do with sacrifices being offered. And so as you're reading through the Old Testament, where Moses is giving the instructions for offering sacrifices to God, one of the things that he says over and over again is, if you do this as God has instructed, it will be an aroma pleasing to the Lord. And so when John says that the fragrance of this perfume filled the house, I think what he's actually pointing to is this idea that Mary's offering, or Mary's sacrifice, was an aroma pleasing to the Lord. But it wasn't pleasing to everybody. Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now here we see how expensive this perfume was. Judas says this could have been sold for 300 denarii. A denarius, that's the singular form of denarii, a denarius would have been a coin given to a day laborer for a full day's work. So if you worked in the fields or you worked in a trade, your pay at the end of the day was 1 denarius. So 300 denarii is a year's wages. They didn't work on the Sabbath. They didn't work on holidays, so 300 days of work. 300 denarii, this is a year's wages. So if we kind of translate that into modern day, this perfume could have cost anywhere between $25,000 and $50,000. Super expensive. And Judas says, why wasn't it sold and given to the poor? And then John says this about Judas. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So John's informing us here a little bit about the character of Judas. And John can write this because he's got hindsight, right? He's writing this long after Jesus has gone back to the Father. And as he thinks about this story, he's like, yeah, Judas, like a week later, betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which, by the way, is about 1/10 of the perfume. So a lot less. And John says, now that I understand who Judas really was and what his true motives really were, I understand better that what he was saying here was not because he was concerned about the poor. It was kind of like this virtue signal that he's saying, you know what? I want to make myself look good. And so I'm going to say something, or I'm going to put something out there that everyone will look at and say, oh, he's super spiritual. Wow, Judas, yes. He says such deep spiritual things, but his heart doesn't match. So Jesus said, leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Now, this is kind of a tough phrase to decipher what Jesus means here when he talks about Mary keeping it for the day of her burial. And if you go to Matthew 26, Matthew was at this banquet also, and he wrote about it, and he phrases it a little bit differently. And if you have a different translation this morning than I'm using, it might be phrased a little bit differently there, because when you're translating from one language to another, sometimes the words get mixed around and it's tough to exactly know what it means. And so let's focus on the really key elements of this phrase, which are this: that Mary had this expensive perfume, she's keeping it, she's reserving it, and it has to do with Jesus' death and burial. Okay? Those are kind of the key elements here of what's going on. And so as I think about what Jesus is actually saying about Mary here, is Jesus is pointing out to everyone at the banquet, and John is now pointing out to us, that Mary probably understood what was going on here better than anybody else did. Now, the first time we meet Martha and Mary, these two sisters, is in Luke chapter 10. Jesus is in Bethany, and Martha invites him to their house and prepares a meal for him. And maybe you remember this story. Martha is busy getting everything ready for the meal, and she's scurrying around, and Mary is just kind of sitting down and hanging out with Jesus. And so Martha comes into the room and says, Jesus, look, I'm working really hard trying to get dinner ready. Mary's just in here doing nothing. Can you please tell her to help me? And Jesus says to Martha, Martha, you're missing the point. What Mary is choosing to do is the more important thing, because she's sitting here with me and she's learning from me. And I think this is a characteristic of Mary throughout Jesus' time on earth, is that she loved to be with Jesus, she loved to listen to Jesus, and she loved to learn from Jesus. And I think Mary paid closer attention to what Jesus said than almost anybody else, and picked up on some of the things that he said that everybody else missed. Now remember, Jesus throughout his ministry talked about the fact that he was going to die. He didn't hide that fact. He told this to his disciples all the time. In fact, just 2 chapters earlier in John, remember he said, I'm the good shepherd, and what does the good shepherd do? He lays down his life for the sheep. I think Mary heard this, and Mary understood this, and Mary was one of the only people who realized Jesus is going to die. And she didn't know how, and she didn't know when, and she didn't know why, but she knew that Jesus was going to die. And so she had this incredibly expensive perfume, and we don't know how she got it. Maybe it was a gift, maybe it was handed down, maybe it was a family heirloom. We don't know where it came from, but she had this incredibly expensive perfume. Because she believed Jesus was going to die, she was saving it so that when he died, she could use it to anoint him. This is really interesting because remember, just a chapter ago, her brother died. And she didn't use the perfume for her own brother because she was saving it for Jesus. But then something happened. Something happened that changed Mary's understanding. She saw the resurrection. She saw Lazarus come back to life, and all of a sudden, she started to think differently about some of the things she had heard Jesus said. Because remember in John 10, when Jesus said, I am the good shepherd and I lay down my life for the sheep, he also said something else. He said, I give up my life of my own, and I have the authority to take it back. And maybe when Jesus said that, most people weren't paying close attention or they weren't listening, but I think Mary heard that and thought, what does that mean? I have the authority to take it back. And then a few weeks later, Jesus is in Bethany and Lazarus is dead, and Jesus says, I am the what? The resurrection and the life. And then he brings Lazarus back to life, and all of a sudden Mary starts thinking, wait a minute. Jesus says he's going to give up his life. Jesus says he has the authority to take back his life. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus says that he is the resurrection. And Mary starts to understand, wait a minute. Maybe Jesus isn't going to stay dead. And so this perfume that I've been waiting to anoint him when he dies with, now I can use it for something different. And for some reason, Mary decides this perfume that she's been saving for Jesus' death, she's going to anoint him with while he is still alive. And in doing so, she makes this powerful statement that he is the king of her life. And so the question is, why does John put this story in his book? Because it's actually a little bit different than all the other stories that he tells us. Now, there's some good stuff here, right? I mean, we can look at this story and see the life change in Martha, the life change in Mary, the life change in Lazarus. You know, Martha is no longer this person who serves and gets angry now. Here she's just happily serving. She's been changed. And Lazarus has become this incredible witness. If you keep reading further on, you learn that the Pharisees want to kill Lazarus because so many people are believing in Jesus as the result of Lazarus' witness. And clearly Mary is someone who is willing to give up anything and everything because of her devotion to Jesus. And so all three of these siblings' lives have been changed by the resurrection, and that's cool because it reminds us that our lives can be changed by the resurrection. And maybe as we look at the story, we can ask ourselves the question, what does Mary value most in this story? And what does Judas value most in this story? And that prompts us to begin to think about maybe what we value most in life and how we demonstrate that value. But what's interesting about this story in the book of John is that there's no signs here, right? There's no miracle here. And really, there's no saying of Jesus where he's teaching about who he really is. And we know that for much of the book, those have been the key elements. Jesus' signs and Jesus' sayings. In fact, we know from John chapter 20 that the reason John wrote this gospel was to do what? To help us see what Jesus has done so that we will believe that Jesus is God and we will receive the eternal life he offers. And yet those elements don't seem to be present here. In fact, the raising of Lazarus was the final sign, so there's no more signs. And Jesus isn't here arguing with the Pharisees or debating with them. In fact, from this moment on in John, everything is going to point towards the cross. So why did John include this story? I think John is trying to teach us something about belief here. I think John is trying to show us what true belief is, what it really looks like to place our faith in Jesus. And he does this by contrasting two people. Because there's a clear contrast here between Mary and between Judas. One of these people believes that Jesus is God. And one of these people does not. One of these people, Judas, he believes that Jesus has come to be a conqueror. And he's waiting for Jesus to take on Rome. Mary understands that Jesus has come to die. And what they believe about Jesus impacts how they respond to Jesus. Mary is devoted to Jesus, and so she's willing to give up everything for him. And Lazarus, he's kind of devoted to himself, and so he wants to hold on to what he sees as valuable. And he wants to use this as an opportunity to make himself look good by saying things like, well, we should just give it to the poor. You see, devotion is demonstrated by extravagant sacrifice. Now, we know this is true. We could a lot of examples in life to see this. You might have been watching basketball the past couple of weekends with the Final Four coming up, and start to think about some of the sacrifices that these athletes make to get to this level. They work hard. They're in the gym. They're practicing. They're shooting all the time. In addition to their studies, they have to be at practice. They make great sacrifices because they're devoted to the game. You know, as you get older, you begin to realize the kinds of sacrifices your mother made for you, right? Because your mother was so devoted to you. She made extravagant sacrifices for you throughout life. We see this in soldiers. Soldiers who are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice because they are devoted to one another and they are devoted to their country. We see this everywhere we look. That devotion is demonstrated through extravagant sacrifice. But it's also true that sometimes what we sacrifice for, or who we sacrifice for, demonstrates that our devotion might be in the wrong place. Consider the person who is more devoted to their job than to their family. And so they're willing to sacrifice for a promotion or for financial gain, but they won't sacrifice for their children. Or consider the person who is devoted to pleasure rather than self-discipline, and so they're willing to sacrifice their purity or relationships, but they're not willing to make a sacrifice to remain holy. You see, devotion is demonstrated through extravagant sacrifice. And Mary showed us this, didn't she? Mary made this extravagant sacrifice, a year's wages for that perfume, and she just poured it out over Jesus, an extravagant sacrifice to demonstrate that she was devoted to him. And go back to what Jesus said to her in verse 7. Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it." I want you to focus on that phrase, because that's the idea of devotion. To keep something is to set it aside, right? To reserve it for a special occasion or for a special purpose. And that's exactly what Mary has done here. She's taken this incredibly valuable possession, probably the most valuable thing she owns, and she has set it aside. She's reserved it for Jesus. This is what it means to believe in Jesus. This is what it means to be devoted to Jesus, is that we are willing to set aside our own plans, our own lives, our own desires for Jesus. We are willing to keep what we think we should do off to the side and say, I'm instead going to live the way Jesus has called me to live. I am going to give him my whole life. You see, sometimes what we have a tendency to do is say, yes, I believe in Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus. But what we actually do is we set aside or reserve the most valuable parts of our life, right? Yeah, I've got this hobby that I really like. I've got this show that I love to watch. I kind of want to keep my money for myself, but Jesus, I'll follow you with everything else. And to be devoted to Jesus, to truly believe that Jesus is God, means I take every part of my life and I set it aside for him. I don't keep back anything for myself. See, all of us are devoted to something, right? In fact, we're all devoted to many things. The question is, are we devoted to him? And how we live, how we act, is how we demonstrate that devotion. There's a story from the life of King David that really illustrates this well. Near the end of his life, David decided against God's command to count the soldiers in Israel. It seems like kind of a funny thing, but really what it's about is that he's relying on himself and his own power and his own ability. He's taking pride in his military conquests instead of relying on God. And so because David does this, and it's sinful, a disease comes to Israel, and it spreads throughout the land, and many people die. But God, in his mercy, stops the disease from spreading before it gets to Jerusalem. In fact, they can actually say there's this field just outside Jerusalem, and beyond that point, no one got sick. And so out of repentance, out of gratitude, David goes to this field to offer a sacrifice to God. And he goes to the owner of the field and says, I need to buy your field from you so that I can make this sacrifice. And the owner says, well, no, you're the king. You can have it. It's yours. But in 2 Samuel 24, David responds to that man by saying, I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. David says, if you give me this field, then I'm not making a sacrifice. If you give me this field, I'm not demonstrating any kind of devotion to God because it's easy. And I don't want to offer anything to God that cost me nothing. Which is exactly what Mary is saying in this story. And it's exactly what it means for us to be devoted to Jesus. Is I will not offer anything that cost me nothing. For Mary, this meant pouring out her perfume at Jesus' feet. And maybe we look at that and say, well, that was easy. That was obvious. Jesus was right there. It's easy to show devotion to Jesus when he's right there. But Jesus isn't right there for us. So what does it look like for me today, 2,000 years later, to show devotion to Jesus? And I would suggest that we demonstrate devotion to Jesus through our relationships with Jesus' people. Remember what Judas said. Judas said, hey, why wasn't this sold and given to the poor? We could have fed so many poor people with this money. And Jesus actually didn't say, Judas, you're wrong, right? He actually said, Judas, not now. He said, the poor you'll always have with you. You'll always have opportunity to give to the poor, but now's not the time because I'm right here. And I think what Jesus is hinting at is, look, while I'm here, you show devotion to me by showing devotion to me. But when I'm gone, you demonstrate devotion to me by how you treat others. See, God has ordained relationships for all of us, right? Husbands, you demonstrate your devotion to Jesus by how you sacrifice for your wife. you ought to be willing and excited to give up anything and everything for the good of your wife. That's how you demonstrate devotion to Jesus. And wives, the same is true for you. Parents, you are ordained by God to bring your children up to know Him and love Him. And you ought to be willing to sacrifice anything and everything to ensure that your children know and love Jesus. That's how you demonstrate your devotion to Him. But this goes beyond the family, right? In John 13, Jesus said, people will know you're my disciples. How? By your love for one another. And the idea is that we demonstrate our devotion to Jesus by how we take care of each other. If I'm devoted to Him, I have to be devoted to His people. I can't say I'm devoted to Jesus and be at war with Jesus' people, right? That's one of the reasons He said to us, you have to be willing to turn the other cheek. You have to seek reconciliation. You have to be willing to serve one another. Because I demonstrate devotion to Jesus by how I treat Jesus' people. And I demonstrate devotion to Jesus by how I treat those who are mistreated. Remember what He said in Matthew 25. He said, many of you will get to the end and say, Lord, how do we know whether or not we were treating you well? And I will say to them, whenever you did so to the least of these my brethren, you did it for me. You see, we demonstrate devotion to Jesus when we care for those who have been marginalized by society, when we care for those who don't have as much as they need, when we're willing to give of what we have to provide for those who have not. That's how we demonstrate devotion to Jesus. This weekend, Liam and I were running some errands, and at one point, we were getting ready to get in the car, and I looked at one of the tires, and I said, that looks kind of low to me. I'm not sure, but it looks kind of low. And so I reached into the glove box and pulled out the little tire gauge thing, and I opened the door, the driver's side door, and looked at the side of the door there to find out, what should the PSI be, and it says the manufacturer recommended PSI is 32. And so I took the tire gauge, and I took the valve stem off, and I stuck it on one of the good tires, and it was right at 32. I checked another one of the tires, and the little white thing pops up out of the tire gauge right at 32. Checked the third one right at 32. And then I went to the one that looked low, and I put the tire gauge on, a little white stick comes out of the gauge, and it's only at 30. Okay, it's low. Now here's the thing. That tire gauge, it didn't fix the tire, right? That tire gauge didn't get the air into the tire. But the tire gauge told me that the tire needed air. And in the same way, how we treat other people, that doesn't save us. How we treat other people doesn't make us right with God. But we can look at our relationships with other people and discover that maybe we need a little more Jesus in our life. You see, if I'm not sacrificing for other people, that's an indication that I'm not devoted to Jesus. Because devotion to Jesus plays itself out through extravagant sacrifice. And so the question for me this morning is, how am I demonstrating my devotion to Jesus? How am I demonstrating my devotion to God? What am I willing to sacrifice for Him? And what am I willing to sacrifice for others? What I'm willing to give up for those around me is a sure sign of how committed I am to the one who gave everything for me. Let's pray. Father, as we move closer to Easter, we're reminded that the main point of this story is that Jesus came to die for us. That He was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf. And we are incredibly grateful for that. And we want to live our lives in response to that sacrifice, and that means that we want to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for You. And I pray this morning for everybody who's here, as they wrestle internally with what it means for them to be devoted, to be sold out, to be set apart for you. Pray that your Spirit would work in our minds and our hearts right now, that you would shape us so that we would think and act and speak like you. Help us to be people that represent you so well in the world because we are sold out to the idea that our love for others is a demonstration of our love for you. In your name, amen.